This is a reminder to stand solidly like an oak tree when everything else around you is changing. We know the one thing that we can count on is that things change. And so I think it makes sense to build inner cathedrals of space and steadiness that don't change based on the whims of the planet and the people around us. A safe harbor internally to withstand the tides. And I want to be clear right here. I don't mean that by standing still, we don't evolve and change and grow on the inside and of course the outside. But from day to day, from hour to hour, I think we can learn a stillness that we rely on that is independent of the changing times. A stillness that we consider like a home base and one that points us to our own divinity and worthiness, and that's ultimately unwavering. And so we practice being still, even when nothing particular is going on to force a hunger for that stillness, because then it can be a seed for later when the roof flies off. I want to tell you a story of one time when I stood still, which caused that stillness caused my metaphorical roof to fly off. And the glory that eventually came from that. I hesitated to tell this story about Charlie, but I decided to because it was one of those marks in my timeline that the practice of stillness hurled me into a greater truth, and actually, I think, a greater life. I first met him when he noticed my sparkly shoes at his photography opening one day in Champaign, Illinois. And we fell in love really quickly, and things moved pretty fast. And I really wanted my life to work with Charlie because he was handsome, clean, and smart. And it turns out he wasn't very emotionally evolved, and he certainly was not generous. But the truth is that I didn't want to fail again in relationship. I didn't want to move again, and I just didn't want to have to tell my mother. I used to fling myself against a man with full heave, hoping that I would be loved the way that I wanted to be, the way that I felt like I should be. I would conform and squish myself to fit into their story without even really realizing that I was unrecognizable. And my love for Charlie was no different. And we settled in Colorado mainly because he'd grown up there, and we wanted a fresh conversation in a city to move to. And the internal whispers started during that transition, during that move, urging me not to move in with Charlie. But money was always the hinge factor with two artists. And so we moved in together when we came to Denver, and we found an old kind of bleak apartment right off Colfax Avenue. And the paint was peeling off the walls, and the kitchen felt really oily and dark. And the doorway to the porch that went out to the porch was wider than usual because the apartments were originally built for tuberculosis patients. A long time ago, people would come to Denver for the high altitude, which was great to heal sick bodies and compromised lungs. And I imagined those old wheelchairs and sick folks had to stay mostly on the big front porch instead of inside the dark rooms of that apartment in order to get well. And that's where I stayed during my time with Charlie. It was kind of like my spirit was already climbing as far as I could towards an escape route. and I didn't really know how to leave. I remember trying to decorate the dusty porch with twinkle lights and little potted plants, and I remember so many nights there tracing the little patterns on the tablecloth, wondering what to do and just feeling pretty sad. I promise I'm getting to the point of the story, and it absolutely does have to do with stillness, but I have to set it up so that you can follow. I dove into yoga when I got to Denver, and it was so incredibly healing for me. I started to see myself as whole and as sturdy again after my brother Benjamin's death, and the practice of breath and movement had everything to do with that. And there was a yoga studio in walking distance to our apartment, and I would walk to class on a regular basis, and my body and my brain were changing for the good, and I could feel the positive transformation on all levels. It was exactly the medicine that I needed, and the inclusion of the spiritual work that accompanies yoga was equally as helpful as the improvement of my physical prowess. But Charlie was in the business of dismantling me and tearing down feelings of bravery and light that I had, and we started to fight more than ever. And later, I learned what he was doing was called gaslighting, and I'm grateful to know now there's actually a word for it. It's like this: this is a metaphor. A person mentions they smell gas, and the gaslighter says they don't, and that you must be imagining it. And this happens over and over again as the gas builds up in the house, and each layer deep, the gaslit person doubts themselves and considers they must be crazy and that it's all in their head. And there's a slow degradation, and the gaslit person has little confidence left by the time the house fire begins, and they pull everybody out, charred and destroyed. And it's a manipulation of the strangest kind, because after some time you can't seem to find your sanity anywhere in sight, and you're pretty sure it's all your fault. When Charlie was in Boston for the week to visit his sister, I took the opportunity to entirely immerse myself in meditation and in yoga, and I stood still almost entirely for a solid week. And I also took the week to drink less wine and eat cleaner. I had become used to this giant bag of plain M&Ms that Charlie left around the house at all times, and when he left, I threw it away. And my dreams cleaned up too, and the details of my dreams were vivid and legible every night. The night before he returned from his trip, I dreamt of a woman named Ashley, and I saw her in the dream, and she was wearing my pink fluffy bathrobe in the tuberculosis doorway in our apartment, and she was leaning against him, very wet and dewy. And I picked him up from the airport the next night with genuine curiosity. And I remember it was nighttime because of the glow of the headlights and the fluorescent profile of Charlie's sharp lines when he ducked into the car. I still remember that. And on the way home, I was reporting the minutiae of the week and mentioned that I'd had a strange dream, and I told him the details of it, including her name and the pink bathrobe. And he was unusually quiet, and I cut my eyes sideways at his profile, and his face had lost all blood, and he was sinking back into his seat. I was driving. And he looked at me with awe and also panic, and he said, "Did she contact you?" And I realized that this had actually happened, that he had slept with someone named Ashley, and I had dreamt about it. And I instantly became a mixture of hot anger and shame, but also disbelief at this new psychic superpower that I seemed to have. So it was a really strange combination of feelings. What's harder to admit is that it took me several tries to clean up the mess. It wasn't fast and it wasn't efficient, and I forgot my self-worth and wellness so many times. I had sex with Charlie the night that I found out about Ashley, primarily because I was searching for connection and for intimacy in something I worried was already gone and was already empty. I was so gutted and so confused. And getting naked made things worse, I'm sure, for both of us. The whole tragic story was eventually a push towards my own power and betterment, but what a disaster. I begged for Charlie even after Ashley and then Sarah, who would later become his wife. And a really fascinating fact is years later, many years later, we both had baby boys within a week of each other. And it's remarkable to think that there was a divine organization even back then. Here is one thing that I know. If I had not chosen to stand still for a week and do something to create space internally, I might have kept fighting for something that wasn't even really good for me. The stillness pushed forward a solution that was too muddy to see in my inner chaos. And that's what stillness can do. It can vastly decrease the muddiness. I think of Charlie now as the vehicle I needed to get to Denver, where an entire life was being held for me in a time capsule. And now I thank his presence in my timeline when I count my gratitude markers, because he played an important part as the friction needed to make a big shift. And those tuberculosis doorways in the Colfax apartment had been a rite of passage for me and something that I had to walk through, I think. I went from blaming him to thanking him because a responsibility to my own wellness was uncovered during the carnage of that relationship. I believe that when we're brave enough to become incredibly still, that the solutions show up in ways often that we could have never imagined.